All right, welcome back to this episode of Let's Talk About Things. I'm your host, Jonathan Reutenberg, and this is part three of my three-part series on why executions are declining across the United States. And in the first episode, we talked about how how we talked about the states, the 23 states now that have abolished the death penalty altogether. Last episode, we talked about the states that still have the death penalty but have not carried out executions. And in this episode, I would like to talk about the states that still do carry out executions and why even there, executions are very much on the decline. But first, I would like to talk about the process of how capital punishment works because it very much represents an opportunity for those who, because every step of it represents an opportunity for those who support capital punishment at the state level to make sure that executions can happen more efficiently. And in my opinion, no state better represents that than the state of Florida. So first, when a person has been found guilty, um, the prosecutor has to then decide to seek the death penalty. Juries can typically impose a higher sentence than what the prosecutor seeks, but the prosecutor has to explicitly seek the death penalty in order for that to be imposed. And this represents a step for Republicans or people who support the death penalty to interfere at the state level. Because if a local prosecutor has decided that he or she is not going to seek the death penalty, the attorney general could seek it instead. In fact, in 2017, the DA in Orlando said she would not seek the death penalty in any case, and so the Republican governor just removed all death penalty cases from her because of that. So, so basically, it's that's the first step is having statewide prosecutors interfere to seek the death penalty when local prosecutors won't do that. Then there's sentencing, and the sentencing procedure basically depends on the state. Most states require a unanimous jury, but I believe that Nebraska has a death penalty imposed by a three-judge panel who have to impose it unanimously. Montana, I believe I said it in the last episode, is the trial judge imposes it unilaterally, and finally, in Alabama, there is no requirement for a unanimous jury. It's a jury, but it's not unanimous. And in Florida, the state Supreme Court has also ruled that a unanimous jury is not required to impose the death penalty, and that represents a potential area for those who support capital punishment to make it to loosen up the restrictions on it, which is to not require unanimity on the jury to impose it. The Supreme Court, by the way, has said you need to be unanimous, but the Florida Supreme Court seems to think that that is only in finding that the person is eligible for the death penalty, i.e., that they are guilty of the crime and that there is an aggravating factor that would warrant it. That for sure would require unanimity. But the Florida Supreme Court believes that the imposition of the death penalty itself is not require does not require unanimity. Then there's a process of direct review and state collateral review that involves like being you're heard as cases heard directly by the courts, and then once the and then once the and then it goes through again. I think taking up issues that could not have been taken up in the direct review. And what's essentially happened is that a number of jurisdictions have consolidated those reviews into one. So it's a state level direct and collateral review that basically could potentially go directly from the trial from the trial to the Supreme Court in order to speed that up. That's something else that I think that those who support the death penalty are very much trying to do. And then finally, after the state level review, it goes to the process of habeas corpus. And that is an entirely federal process. So that is not something that the states can do to change. But the Supreme Court has, in the last few years, taken a less tolerant approach to what they view as delay tactics. I think people like Justice Neil Gorsuch, have said, because the death penalty is constitutional, we need to make sure that it happens. And there was the cases of someone who was on death row for more than 20 years, and he was like saying, this is not an appeal, this is a delay tactic. And I think that the courts, and the federal courts certainly, I think, are becoming less tolerant of stuff like that. So that all represents opportunities for for those who support the death penalty to expedite that process and make sure executions can happen faster. In fact, the Florida Supreme Court on the state level said they're not going to automatically review cases that are found by the jury, and I think they can still appeal, but the process is no longer automatic. So a number of cases. There was a number of rulings that was part of a series of rulings that happened in 2020 by the Florida Supreme Court loosening restrictions on the death penalty. And I think that no one seems to be more enthusiastic about loosening restrictions on the death penalty at the moment than the Florida Supreme Court. Um, but there are some competitors, and a lot of that has to do with the process of lethal injection, which I talked about in the last episode. And for that, I'm actually going to share my screen to show you what I'm talking about. And we are back on the Wikipedia page. These are the states that have adopted or not adopted lethal injection. The ones in bright orange have lethal injection, and as I said, every state that has the death penalty still primarily uses lethal injection. But the states that are in bright orange actually have an alternative method, and and as I've mentioned in the previous episode, lethal injection has become particularly vulnerable because the manufacturers of the drugs and the people and physicians all refuse to be involved in executions because it's a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. So states who have sometimes resorted, particularly the ones in dark orange, have resorted to pretty devious methods to be able to obtain the drugs that are necessary for this. But what's happened, I think that's become more common, and I think it's particularly recently in the states like Tennessee and Utah and Oklahoma and South Carolina, is that they have basically said, yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to carry out lethal injections anymore, but we're going to we're going to go back to some of the older methods like electrocution. I believe that Tennessee and Oklahoma, uh, Tennessee, I believe, adopted electrocution in the past few years. I believe Utah readopted the firing squad, and in and in South Carolina, they are currently debating legislation that would also add the firing squad, but would make lethal injection the primary method, so that basically they would abandon lethal injection altogether. And so I'm basically gonna just point out some of the states that are up here. Like the states in red are the ones that have carried out executions in the past few years, but there, but some of them have not done so all that recently. Let's go in order. South Carolina is one of the states that I mentioned that, like Louisiana, has not carried out an execution in the last few years because they have not been able to obtain the drugs. But there is a legislation that is currently being debated, and I think it just needs to pass the state house at this point. Um, and is signed by the governor, that would basically make the electric chair the primary method of executions. And I believe it would be the first state that would basically abandon lethal injection as the primary method and instead resort to the electric chair. And I think this is all part of a recognition that lethal injection, rather than being, I sometimes like to think that lethal injection was adopted as a way to placate concerns about whether the death penalty being cruel and unusual. They basically try to find the supposedly least cruel and unusual way to do so, even though lethal injection has the highest botch rate of any method of executions that are currently done. And and so and so I think that states are sort of coming around to realizing that lethal injection has not brought the promise I think some were hoping for, and instead they're going back to things like the electric chair and the firing squad. Um, so that's what's happened in South Carolina, and in Idaho, I think they've also had trouble getting the drugs. The last execution there was in 2012, and they've lost a court case. Like in the state of Indiana, they have lost a court case that in order to keep the case's source of the drug secret, and that's going to have implications. There are actually a number of states that have passed laws. I think Georgia and Arkansas are among them that have passed laws to keep the source of the drugs that they use for capital punishment secret because they don't want the bad publicity. But I think that it's ultimately people have ways of being able to discover this through public for freedom of information, and so we're slowly finding out some of the ways that people are coming around to obtaining the drugs. Like I talked about in the last episode, Idaho obtained drugs from a compound pharmacy in Salt Lake City, and that was one of the more recent executions that have taken place. I think either 2011 or 2012, and so that is a that is definitely a state that has not been able to carry out executions in a while, and may not be able to do so for a while because they lost that court case. They only have 8 people on death row at the moment. It's not to say that they currently have a governor who opposes capital punishment by any stretch of the imagination, but it doesn't sound like executions are going to be taking place all that soon. Mississippi, for a long time, they also had last execution in 2012. They've been slower to execute people because poor counties are not able to afford defense attorneys fees, and so death sentences get overturned on based on ineffective assistance of counsel. An execution might be happening sometime next year, because there is someone who has exhausted their appeals, but that is a state that for systemic reasons has not been able to carry out executions, and but they might be able to carry one out eventually, because sometimes things do go right. Arizona and Oklahoma are a couple states that I talked about in the last episode that had real problems with lethal injection. They both had botched executions, and like a number of states that I've mentioned, have not been able to obtain the drugs that they need. I think that South Carolina, Indiana, Louisiana, Idaho, Arizona, Oklahoma have all had bouts where they have not been able to get the drugs that they need to carry out executions. Well, in the case of Indiana and Louisiana, they have yet to solve that issue. In Idaho, I think they've yet to solve that issue. But while in South Carolina, they're readopting the electric chair. Whereas in Arizona and Oklahoma, I think in the past year or so, both states claim that they have found new sources for drugs. So this is one of the couple times where they think they actually do have the drugs to carry out executions. I think in case of Arizona, there might be some shady business involved in how they got these drugs. There's been investigative reporting on that, but it represents a real struggle that I think a lot of states have, and I don't believe Arizona is one of the states that only has lethal injection. As a matter of fact, right there, Arizona does have a backup method, and as a matter of fact, I believe that backup method is in fact I thought it was the electric chair, but I could very well be wrong about that. Actually, it's lethal gas in Arizona. So that is something to keep in mind, is that some states do think that they're able to obtain the drugs, but it's never it's not never really been in a clean way. Other states have had executions more recently, like but I mean, before I was going to say that basically the whole lethal injection debate also represents another opportunity, like I said, for states to reimpose the death penalty and remove impediments to its performance by basically reintroducing new methods like South Carolina has. And I think that we're going to see more states, colored in this lighter shade of orange, and that could allow for executions to take place. Although, because I think the public, might be, more shocked by the idea of a electric chair, that is something that could potentially speed up the opposition to capital punishment. Because lethal injection, I think, is becoming increasingly untenable, and I think they're going to have to go back to more brutal methods like the electric chair or the firing squad, which could, potentially speed up opposition to the use of capital punishment in general. But anyway, other states have had more recent history with the use of capital punishment. Arkansas, but it's also not exactly that recent. Arkansas, for example, had their last executions in 2017. Nebraska's was in 2018, a couple of years after they voted to retain capital punishment. And Florida and South Dakota each had their last executions in 2019. South Dakota, in particular, has only one person on death row at the moment. So they may be close to being the next state to having no one on death row. So that is going to be another state worth keeping an eye on, because the states out west, I do believe, the state, well, actually west of Texas, like not including South Dakota, but these states like Montana, Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, Utah, Idaho, Nevada, California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii, and Alaska. None of these states a lot of these states have abolished the death penalty, but even those that haven't, there hasn't been an execution in this part of the country, I believe, since 2014. So that is something. It's really, and we're going to see that there is going to be a regional divide in terms of imposition, in terms of executions actually being carried out, and I'm going to show you that in a little bit. But there were only 5 states, by the way, last year that carried out executions last year. They were, and I believe that they were Alabama, uh, Georgia, Missouri, Tennessee, and Texas. Um, so there we go: Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, Missouri, and Texas. And as I think a lot of people know, Texas leads the nation in terms of executions. They've actually had more than a third of the total since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. But I am going to just show you something, which is that even in those states, the overall decline of the death penalty, is strike here. Look at that. There's a peak in the late 90s and in early 2000s when there was, I believe, a craze for the death penalty. I think from the mid 80s through the late 90s, I think polls were consistently showing that 80% of Americans almost supported capital punishment. And as you can see, in the 21st century, there's been a steep drop off. And that has also coincided, this period of drop off beginning in 2000 has coincided with the fact that there has not been a single state in this period that has formally reinstated capital punishment in the 21st century. So over the course of the 21st century, no state has reinstated capital punishment, and overall executions have declined. And we can see this not just by nationally, but we can also see it by state. I'm just going to scroll through these very slowly so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. But I think what's going to become clear is that there are a number of states. Some of these states, by the way, have actually formally abolished the death penalty in that time, like Delaware and Connecticut. But I think what's going to become clear is that the South, in parts of the South, is really where I think executions have been concentrated. And but not everyone in the South. For example, Kentucky, has not had a lot. Louisiana has also not had a lot, honestly. Mississippi, as I've said before, has not had a lot. Missouri has had quite a few, but I think you're getting the sense here, just from the numbers that I'm showing you, that executions overall have been declining. Ohio is another state that I think has had a bit of a higher rate of executions, but they've formally suspended because they're not going to do lethal injection anymore. Oklahoma, that's a particularly big one because I believe it's now the second largest executor in the nation, although they haven't had an execution since 2014. As you can see there, they've executed quite a few people. But again, there's not a lot that I can say that I haven't already said. You could make the argument here that Tennessee, there's been a particular rise in the last few years. Maybe you could argue that Tennessee has gone the other way, but look at that. Texas, the state that has executed far more people than any other state in the country, and over a third of the executions in modern times, only had 3 executions last year. And that, I believe, is the lowest that it has been since 1996. In fact, I think it ties with 1996, 1988, and 1984 as the lowest number of executions per year since 1983. So, there's a sign that even in the solid South, like Virginia, was once, I think, the largest per capita executions in the country. I think in much of U.S. history, they abolished it this year. So I think, and this brings me to a point I'd like to say that it is not only just the case that executions have overall been declining. It is worth pointing out that since July 8th of last year in 2020, there has not been a single state level execution. In fact, next Saturday, May 8th, will mark 10 months since the last state execution. Since then, in that time, the federal government did go on an execution spree. As you can see, in 2020, they executed 10 people, and then January of 2021, they executed 3. That was all in the last 6 months of Trump's term. But in that time period, there's not been a single state level execution. And and this year, I think, as other people, as Death Penalty Info has noted, um, there's only one state that has even scheduled any executions for any time this year, and that is Texas. And it's not a guarantee, I think, that the executions like that are going to happen, but we'll ultimately have to see. But I think that this is the longest time in about 40 years since there has been a state level execution. And like I've said, it has not been for a lack of trying. States have done Many states have done everything that they can to try to get executions to happen faster. But I think, as we've seen, in the videos that I've done so far, that executions are very much on the decline, because I think people are recognizing, first of all, it's expensive. It actually costs more to execute someone than it does to put them in jail for the rest of their lives, and also it doesn't bring closure, to victims. I think that the idea that it brings closure to victims, I think research shows that that is not really the case. And finally, it is not a deterrent to violent crime. The states that have the death penalty are very much the ones with the highest levels of violent crime, and there's no evidence that its use deters violent crime, and there's no evidence that the states that have abolished it have seen a spike in violent crime. So I think that what people are coming, and I think what younger people are coming around to, particularly younger conservatives, is that this is a big government tool. How can you? I think there was a Utah lawmaker who basically said, you believe that the government is not really good at anything, and yet we trust it to take people's lives. And I think more and more people are coming around to that realization. And I think that the states are basically acting accordingly and are doing away with what I think most people recognize is an outdated form of punishment. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this 3-part series on the why executions are declining. I hope you really enjoyed it. I tried to pack as much information in as I can, but I don't think it was all that professional, but I tried to do my best. But I really hope you enjoyed. I hope you click subscribe, because there's more content that'll be coming eventually, and I'll see you guys for the next video.